Hi everyone, welcome back. In the last video, we discussed about this package.json file. Then we also discussed about this package log.json file and then this node modules folder. So if you haven't watched the last video, please go and watch it. It's a really cool video and in that video you will learn a lot of things. And without further ado, let's start today's video. So in this video, we are going to learn about two things: named export and default export. Okay, so this video is gonna be really short. So let's learn about named export and default export. Okay, and why do we need these two types of export? Okay, why we have two types of export, named and default export. So to learn that, let's make a new file in this demo one and let's call it calculation. If you remember, we have made this file many times. Okay, and let me copy the code of this calculation from here. So I'm copying this from here to here. Okay, so we have this calculation file and let me delete this thing. Okay, and let me make another file. Let's call it index.js, and again let me copy everything from here to here. Okay, so now let's come to our calculation.js file. Here we are going to learn about named export and default export. So named export and default export. Okay, so we have to learn these two things, what is named export and default export. Okay, so when we have multiple functions, okay, so when we have multiple functions and we want to selectively export them. For example, I have like 4 functions and let's say I don't need this mul function. All I need is this add function, subtract function and this division function. So what I'm doing, I'm selectively trying to export these things. So I'll write export in front of the function. Okay, so export add function, export this subtract function and export this div function. So write export. Okay, so from this file or from this module, I am exporting this add function, subtract function and this div function, but I am not exporting this mul function. Okay, so I am selectively exporting. So whenever we have to selectively export functions or variables, we use named export. So this is what we called it as named export. Okay, so what is a name export? Basically, named export is used when we have to selectively export variables and functions from a module. Okay, so let's learn how we can import these functions, this function add, subtract and division. So let's come to our index.js file. Let me remove this from here and let me try to import. Okay, so how do we import? We write import and curly braces. Okay, so if you remember, in this calculation.js file, I exported this add, subtract and div function. So how do I import it? So I write curly braces and the name of the functions that I exported, that are add, sub and div. So in the curly braces, I write add, sub and div from the path. So ./calculation.js. Okay, let's try to run this file, this index.js file, which is present in this demo folder. So how do I run this? I write node -- watch. I am running it in a watch mode, index.js, and we are getting an error. So let's see this error. It is saying cannot use import statement outside a module. Cannot use import statement. Okay, I get it. In the package.json file, oh yeah, we are not mentioning the module pattern. So let's type, and which module pattern do we need? We need this ES module, and I think this will work now. So let me close this and let's try to run it again. Okay, so it is showing 7 and -3. Okay, so our code is working fine. And let's come to our calculation.js file. So again, if to export selectively from a module, then we use named export. Okay, so we selectively exported this add, subtract and div function. Okay, and when do we use this default export? So let's make another file and let's call it logger.js. Okay, and let's write a function. Let's call it function logger. It does nothing, it just do console.log. It just logs my name. Okay, so it just logs my name Arvind. Okay, so if you see this file or if you see this module, we have only one function. So whenever you have only one function, then you export by default. Okay, so here I can export by default. How do I do it? We write export and we add this default. Okay, so export default function. Okay, I can also do this export default and then here the name of the function, that is logger. Okay, so I can do this or I can do this. Right now it is giving me an error because here I am trying to default export two things. I am trying to export this function as well as this one. Okay, and remember one thing, you cannot default export two functions or variable from a single file. So here I am trying to default export this and this, that is why it is giving me an error. So let me remove this and the error is gone. And let me come to this index.js file. How do I import it? So to import a default export, you write import and here we don't use this curly braces. Okay, what we do, we write the name of the variable or function. So it was logger, I guess, from /logger.js, and let's try to use this function. So logger, I think I just have to call this function and it will work, and it is showing me Arvind over here. So this logger function is also working. Let's come to our calculation.js file. Okay, and let's try to export this mul function default. Okay, let's try to default export this mul function. So how do we do it? We write export default function mul. If I try to default export this div function, let's see what happens. You know, it will give us an error. Okay, so let's see the error. So default, and it is not giving me an error. Oh, it is giving me error over here. It is saying duplicate export of default. So in one module you can have only one default export but multiple name export. So let's remove this default from here. Okay, so in this calculation.js file we have three named export, first, second, and this is the third one. Okay, and we have only one default export. We have this mul function, that is default export over here. So let's try to import it in our index.js file. So again, how do we import a default export? So we write import, we don't use curly braces, we write the name of the function, and here the name of the function is mul from /calculation. Okay, so let's try to use this function. Here I should call this function mul and it should print 10 over here, which is printing 10. So it is working. Okay, so if you see over here, I'm importing this mul function from this calculation.js file and I'm importing these three functions from the same file, and this doesn't look good. Okay, so what we can do, I can remove this mul function. Okay, and I can import it from here. I can do mul comma. Okay, and I have to remove this from here and it will work. Okay, so what does it mean? It means this mul function is a default export and this is named export. Okay, so from this calculation.js file we have like 4 exports, 3 named export and 1 default export. Here don't get confused. Let me tell you when do we use named export and default export. So if we come to our calculation.js file and if we want to selectively export functions or variables, multiple functions or variables from a file, then we use named export. For example, we are named exporting this add, sub and div. So multiple exports, named export. Okay, so when we have two multiple exports, we use named export. And when we have only one function or a variable in a file, then we generally do a default export of that function. For example, here I have this logger function, so I did export default. Okay, so remember this thing, multiple functions, then we use named export. If we have a single function, then we use default export. Also, we cannot have multiple default exports in one file. For example, if I do default over here, it will give me an error, and this error is duplicate export of default. Okay, so let me remove this. So here in this file, I am doing 3 named export and 1 default export. How do we import it? So in this index.js file, we use curly braces for named export and without curly braces for default export. For example, this logger file, it doesn't have a curly braces. Okay, so that means this logger file is default exported. Okay, so if you come to here, it is default exported from here. Okay, so this is it for this video. I hope you understood the difference between name export and default export. And from the next video onwards, we are going to build our first project, that is command line interface notes application. So before the next video, I want all of you to revise everything that we have learned so far, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.